Доброго дня. Hello, everybody. Let us begin the presentation of a post-Putin book by Herman Pirchner, the Junior, American scholar, think tanker, a person, an intellectual who has been following Ukraine and Soviet Union, Russia, and our region since 1982. So welcome. My name is Ostap Kryvdik. I'm an associate analyst with the Ukrainian Catholic University Analytical Center. Also, Hanna Hopko, chairwoman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the Parliament of Ukraine in 2014-2019, is joining us today. For the Analytical Center of the Ukrainian Catholic University, the topic of Russia is of an utmost importance. We are working with the topic of Ukraine's future, and Ukraine's future is very closely tied to the Ukrainian-Russian war, which is war of independence for Ukraine. The publication of the book in Ukrainian was sponsored by Mr. Vitaly Demyanuk, so let us express sincere gratitude to this person who made publication possible by his donation to the Analytical Center. So first, Mr. Pirchner, the floor is to you. Please share your main takeaways, your main points of a very insightful book that has to let us know what to expect from post-Putin's Russia. The floor is yours.
The first idea is that Putin is not forever. All dictators leave power at some point. How they leave power is interesting. We did a study of 127 post-World War II dictatorships that had 10 million or more population. 42% of those dictators were removed by coups. 21 were killed. An additional number, of course, died of natural causes. Now, Putin is well aware of these numbers, and I think he fears for his own safety and his own ability to stay in power. This is why you have increasing repression inside of Russia, and it contributes to Russia's aggressiveness in the world, which Putin feels detracts attention from his own failures at home. Now, when he goes, it's not predictable, but some things are predictable, that when he goes, there's likely to be a power struggle inside of Russia. Remember, it took Stalin perhaps 14 years to fully consolidate power. It took Khrushchev maybe 5 years, and the help of the army when the effort was made to remove him by Brezhnev in 57, and so forth. Brezhnev himself took some years to consolidate power. Now, while that power consolidation is going on, there's going to be a tendency of Russia to look inward, to worry about its own leadership, and probably to project force not to project power as aggressively in the rest of the world. This creates some opportunities for Ukraine and other people, other countries threatened by Russia. The first point is that dictators lose power usually through coups or through assassination. And when Putin leaves power, there's going to be a struggle for power, as there was under Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and that struggle for power is going to take some years. During the powerful struggle, the contenders for power are likely to look at, not just likely, it'll be necessary for them to look for support from the main institutions in Russia, especially those that have the ability to exercise force. The Russian army has 1 million people, 2.5 million reserves. They were responsible for Khrushchev keeping power in 57. They helped Yeltsin maintain power in 93 when the elements shelled the Russian White House. But if the military does not intervene, those in Russia that have lesser force, the 25,000 Spetsnaz of the GRU, for instance, the 340,000 approximate people of the National Guard. Other institutions can play different roles. The MVD certainly has blackmail capability. The oligarchs and regional elites have economic capabilities to influence people. But when all this plays itself out, you eventually will have some sort of leader that begins to consolidate power over a period of years. And that leader will have two basic courses of action. One, they can try to govern as Putin governed, or they can make slight adjustments, trying to have some sanctions lifted. In that case, Ukraine and others will need to have the capability to talk to Westerners who might be tempted to lift sanctions without full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. That's certainly something that would be tried. It probably would be tried more should reformers come to power in Moscow, reformers who would promise to adhere to international norms, who would promise to settle with Ukraine. And the question will be, are any sanctions lifted? Is any pressure taken off of Russia before there's full withdrawal from Ukraine, before other obligations are met, or are the things done in a staggered basis? These will be questions Western capitals contend with, and there'll be questions for Ukrainian diplomacy and the amount of power they exercise in an influence they exercise in Western capitals or within Russia itself. I think it's most likely that neither further repression a la Putin and further aggression nor efforts to reform are likely to be successful, at least not for some years. And during that period of time, as chaos comes to Russia, there'll be time perhaps for Ukraine and other countries to be less under pressure from Russian military and to consolidate reforms. And it may also be a time of danger for Russia as China begins to exercise their traditional claims against Russian territory in the Far East and Eastern Siberia, land that Russia took from China in 1858 and 1860. Should that occur, Russian attention may focus more on the East than it has on the West. In any case, no country is arguably more affected by the change of power that will come to Russia and the policy changes that may or may not be made. And the main message I have in the book is contingency plans need to be made now, because the time to act to maximally influence events may be very short. And if plans are not on the shelf, that of course need to be adapted to current circumstances, then the time to act may be longer than necessary to have maximum impact.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Now I would like to welcome to our discussion Hanna Hopko. Madam Hopko was a leader on Ukraine's parliamentary policy regarding national minorities in Russia. So every real Democrat has to stick to the principles and the way we adhere to our national minorities in Ukraine. Of course, we expect the very same approach to be taken from the very those who demand the rights for the minorities in Ukraine. So overall, Ukraine's and Russia's destinies are tied. How does Russia influence Ukraine now? And what influence may Ukraine have over Russia in the post-Putin time?
Thank you, Ostap. I would stress that Russia's destiny depends on Ukraine. So, and the same Europe's destiny depends on Ukraine. So, because Ukraine is not about problem, it's about solutions. Solutions to the geopolitical issues and challenges which I could say the world is facing, not just the European Union or some institutions. So let me start to express my gratitude to Herman Pirchner for his work, for his book. I think it's really very important for Ukrainians to read this book, and especially for decision makers and people from the National Council of Security and Defense. And also for Western audience, this book is really very valuable because it seems like when we are talking about sanctions, but sanctions are instrument, not a real strategy towards Putin's Russia, and the questions what next after Putin. And I'm glad that there are different scenarios described in the book, what could happen with Putin and what the US should do and be prepared for different scenarios. But it seems like after Putin, we will see Putinism epoch is not ended. And also, when Ukrainian president started sanctions against Mr. Medvedchuk and Mr. Kozak, and also we banned pro-Kremlin TV channels or so-called TV channels. So at that time, I made a statement that post-Medvedchuk in Ukraine is the beginning of post-Putin in Russia. So why it's really important? Because Putin is a sponsor of terrorism, and I think we have to demand to recognize Russia as a sponsor of state terrorism. And also I think it's important to mention that we have to help the West to build the strategy, because from MH17, Salisbury, poisoning of different people, including Navalny, so we are seeing reactive policy instead of proactive preventive measures. And this year, marking the 30th anniversary of renewed independence, is important to summarize our struggle for democratic transformation of Ukraine against Kremlin attempts to keep Ukraine in Russian sphere of influence. So I would dare to say that Russia failed to keep Ukraine in Russian sphere of influence, and Russia failed to discredit Ukraine or to promote Ukraine as a failed state, because Ukraine is a democracy in action. And what Mr. Pirchner told us that, and in his book is also from Yeltsin time to Putin's time. So within these 30 years after Soviet Union collapsed, from some expectations in the West that during Yeltsin time, Russia could turn into the democratic state, unfortunately, we've seen Putin's times when Russia turned into the autocracy, with kleptocracy, with strategic corruption, which is an instrument to undermine stable democracies, from interference in elections to subversive events or in Czech Republic. So I think it's really important to learn the lessons from Soviet Union collapsed, and now to be more prepared for different scenarios, what could happen with Putin. And I agree, we have to be ready to answer what to do with China and Chinese expansionism and negative influence on democratic transformation, not just at the European continent or Africa, but globally.
Thank you, Hanna. Mr. Pirchner, I would like to get back to your point that we all have to think of the contingency planning. And you mentioned a possible period of chaos when in Russia when Putin will leave. Usually the entities of the kind, I would call them empires. Before they collapse, they go to war. We are already at war with Russia, but this is a kind of stalemate. What should we, the Ukrainians, expect of a possible turbulence in Russia before and during the change of power there? And can the West, can the United States see that challenge, and how can they help us?
I think it's not possible to predict in advance what post-Putin government would do with regard to war and military aggression. It depends who comes to power. It may be that they simply withdraw and become less of an immediate threat, but it's also possible that the new people seek to consolidate power by going to war and have further aggression against Ukraine. It may be if Putin feels his grasp on power slipping, he also may become aggressive. I think the point of the book is it's not possible to know 100%, but you should, to a large degree, to be able to describe the different possibilities and develop plans for each of them, so that if things happen quickly, Ukraine and other countries who should do the same thing are ready to move quickly. I think Ukraine has a great role to play in helping to shape opinion worldwide. What country knows more really about Russia, its culture, its leadership, and its system than Ukraine? And to the extent that there's interaction with Ukrainian decision makers, with people in Ukraine that influence policy, and those that have similar positions in other countries, I think it's very helpful and would help other countries as they expand their knowledge base to come to a saner or a more effective, is a better word, more effective policy.
Thank you very much for your answer. It still leaves the field for the forecast open, from the darkest scenarios to the more mild, say, a democratic revolution and a specific transformation of the country that calls itself a federal republic but actually isn't the one of the kind. My next question goes to Hanna Hopko. So if Russia becomes federal, how can Ukraine help? Maybe you can share some of the experiences of your parliamentary work with that issue as well. So how do you see Russia's transformation in the course of the next 10 to 20 years? And how do you see it with the forecast that Mr. Pirchner gives in his book, that some of the national minorities of Russia may consider independence, some may still stay in some federal or confederal unity with the main Russia's territorial core, and considering Chinese moves regarding the Asian part of Russia? How do you see the transformation?
Thanks, Ostap. I think the key message from Mr. Biden, the President of the United States, to Putin during their meeting in Geneva was, Mr. Putin, you have a real enemy at your border. This is China. So actually you have to tackle this problem. Otherwise, the expansionism or occupation of Russian territory is happening right now. We've seen a lot of political influence of China representative of decision-making process in Russian Federation. So I think the real threat for the future of Russia is China. But unfortunately, Putin doesn't care about the future of Russia Federation. He cares only about his power, how to sustain his power. This is why he amended constitution last year, and not to win or election. So probably it's mistaken to say that to win election, because in Russia compared to Ukraine, you don't need to win election. All elections are very predictable. So it's hard to say what could happen in Russian Federation, because there could be collusion. And if tomorrow we will see American sanctions against Putin personally, and all oligarchs around Putin will understand that for them it's much easier to dismiss Putin than to face all these problems. And there are different, how to say, centers, military, business community, also geographical. And recently we've seen different protests from Kalmykia, Yakutia, Vladivostok, Idel-Ural or Volga region, 6 republics. So, and Bashkortostan with their, and Tatarstan with their oil sources, and all repressions of Putin's regime against national minority, indigenous peoples, also creates a new, how to say, a new, I wanted to say opportunity, for, but creates for future problems for Putin's regime. And one day it will be like domino principle, will be impossible to control the situation. And unfortunately, it seems like Putin didn't receive this message well from Mr. Biden, how geopolitically to sustain Russia in facing problems from China. But I remember my conversation with Marta Farion in Washington when she shared her memory within the diaspora people, like when Ukraine renewed independence, everybody was saying like, oh, it's only for 5 or 10 years. Then it seems like impossible that Ukrainians will manage to rule the state and to build institutions and others. Now it's 30 years of renewed independence. So I would say that I have a vision on next 10 years for Ukraine, and I'm like sure that Ukraine will become a NATO member, not just because we want it and it's incorporated into our constitution, because NATO needs Ukraine with our practical, unique experience of countering, deterring Russian hybrid warfare. So this is our contribution to the alliance and also to the security at the European continent. And I think also successful Ukraine is a nightmare for Putin and his regime. But for Russian citizens, one day they have to wake up and to realize that all these more than 2 decades of Putin ruling Russian Federation, they have more and more demographical problems, social problems, lack of jobs, and no future, less optimism regarding their future in Russian Federation. So I think the key mission of Ukraine in 21st century is not to defend the truth, and also to defend the values, because we are dying for fundamental values, and but also to help Russian Federation to transform itself by showing the true example of democratization, and also to build this democracy belt around Putin's regime, and to help national minority, to help I wanted to say opposition, but unfortunately within all these decades, Putin did everything possible to destroy opposition in Russian Federation, and there are
Belarus
and Belarus as well. So our goal is, and I'm happy to see the Lublin Triangle, where Ukraine, Poland and Lithuania are working together with Brussels and Washington. I'm also enjoying now seeing the future visit of 3 ministers from Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova to Brussels, associated trio, to discuss how 3 countries as a trendsetters of the region of Eastern Europe, what are our contribution in the future transformation of authoritarian regimes and how to tackle kleptocracies, which undermining democratic processes, not just in transition democracies, but also in stable one.
Thank you for your answer. It looks that Ukraine might have a special role in changing Russia, and changing Russia might define the future of the world in the 21st century to a certain extent. So Ukraine, as Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, is one of the beacons of the world. Mr. Pirchner, I would like to get back to your forecast on Russia. There is a very interesting page where you profile, you don't really name them, but you profile possible successors for Putin. I wonder if the future Russia, if it doesn't deeply transform, is going to be really democratic. Do you see a constituency in that democratic Russia? Do you see democratic Russia, knowing that you have experience of working with democratic Russia in early 90s? You were one of those who were really building bridges between the United States and the newly emerging democratic forces in Russia, and you witnessed their decline from a very close distance. So could you please elaborate on who could be the future leader of Russia after Putin, and in this perspective, whether democracy in Russia has a chance?
I think in the immediate aftermath of Putin, it's unlikely that it will go to democracy. It may go to a less severe authoritarian regime. It may even go to a regime that is less imperialistic. I share Hanna Hopko's opinion that there are deep divisions in Russia, especially among the nationalities. I might even go so far as to say that it's a bit of a pre-revolutionary condition. You know, Lenin once said, from a spark comes the flame. And I don't know if the spark will come. Sometimes it's completely unpredictable. The whole Arab Spring began because a street vendor set himself on fire in Tunisia. Nobody in their wildest dreams could predict something like that. But I think it's possible some event could ignite the passions in Russia and the frustrations and the disappointments among the people. If that happens or begins to happen, it may be an incentive for some members of the elite to split. And I think a coup attempt happens in Russia only at such time as there is a split in the elite, and with support of the anti-Putin faction by some elements of the force ministries. If that happens, crowds that are willing to come to the street may be used as part of an effort to topple. It's, as I said in the book, Putin may survive, Castro survived to the end, but the chances of him going and the conditions for him going even in the near future, I believe, are there. If the spark is lit, if the flame begins, if the repression that will follow works, all these are open questions.
Thank you for your answer. So, not too much hope for the democratic Russia in the nearest term, but possibly that rhythm of more authoritarian, less authoritarian. But we do remember that Khrushchev, who was a bit less authoritarian from inside, still was a player in the Caribbean crisis, which put the world on the brink of the nuclear war. So here, some internal liberalism doesn't really mean the softer foreign policy. Might be even quite contrary in certain moments, isn't it?
Yeah, if I may answer on that, one of the reasons Khrushchev was finally toppled was the fact that he was seen to be an adventurist and pushed the world too close to war over Cuba. And I think that lesson hasn't been lost on everybody in Russia. There will be voices of caution. The great danger regarding future Russian aggression has to do with them believing their own propaganda. As Putin probably believed when he thought he could go all across southern Ukraine and create Novorossiya. When you believe things are possible that aren't, there's misjudgments, and wars can start that way. So that is a fear of mine.
So we may consider an option when the inner Putin circle will see Putin as too adventurous, and it might be a reason for the change. Let me turn back to Hanna. I would like to ask her about the issue which bothers Ukraine the most now. It's the question of the occupation and reintegration of Ukraine's occupied region of some parts of Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast, and Crimea. It seems to me that if Ukraine manages to deoccupy those regions in some mid perspective, it might deeply influence Russia from inside. Uh, does Ukraine have a chance to deoccupy those regions? If so, how? And is there any support for that from inside Russia? Do those Russians who support return of Crimea and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk lands to Ukraine understand how it will change Russia?
Thank you, Ostap. Well, first of all, we in Ukraine are preparing the Crimea platform this August. So this is a part of our strategy of restoring territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And of course, it's important to work with Ukrainians living close to the occupied, temporary occupied territories. Last Friday, I visited Mariupol and met with different people from patriotic groups to local entrepreneurs. And I think it's really important for Ukraine to keep fighting with the oligarchs. And I'm very thankful to the US congressmen like Mercy Kaptur, Brian Fitzpatrick, both Republicans and Democrats, for demanding from the White House and State Department sanctions, and besides sanctions, extradition of Mr. Firtash. Why I'm mentioning de-oligarchization? Because it's also a key to the successful transformation of Ukraine. Because within 30 years, it seems like it was really hard to demonopolize or to make Ukraine free from negative oligarchic influence.
It is important also to mention that the loss of Donbass and Crimea also happened because of the oligarchic influence.
Yes, so I mentioned in this connection, and even 7 years ago, when Ukrainian army and battalion Azov and Dnipro, they liberated or make Mariupol free from the occupants from Russia. So they also mentioned some negotiation between Akhmetov and Novinsky with Russian side. So I think Firtash, Akhmetov, Kolomoisky, Medvedchuk, and others, so they are in close connection to Putin's regime. And now we're discussing the situation with Babin Yar and how not to allow Russian oligarchs, which are in the American sanction list, to use history or tragedy of Babin Yar in building the loyalty to them. And I think history also matters here. And this year, besides marking 30th anniversary of renewed independence, we also marking 300th anniversary when Peter the Great renamed Moscovia into Rus, Russia, stealing from Rus the title. So by stealing the history, Russia is grabbing the territory. So this policy one day has to stop. And I truly believe that we And I hope that institutionally Ukraine will be more stronger in having strategy of deoccupation and also working then with healing the wounds, because I think on the level of citizens after passportization, which is happening every day, and it's also another instrument how Putin is preparing for different scenarios what to do with Donbass by passportization. So, Ostap, I think that, as I mentioned, successful Ukraine is important also for Russian society to see that transformation is possible for the sake of the prosperity of citizens. And this is also our goal through reforms from defense and security sector, economic development, social issues. It's not just about Euro-Atlantic integration, but it's also about demonstration for people who are suffering from authoritarian regimes, like in Russian Federation, in Lukashenko's Belarus, in Uyghurs. Also, I have to mention situation with human rights violation and what Chinese are doing with Uyghurs. So I think it's important for Ukraine to show this example, because by our fighting for restoring territorial integrity and sovereignty, we are not just fighting for restoring the security architecture, which was broken by military invasion in 2014. It's more also about respect to the international rule of law, international human rights issues, and also it's about restoring the moral power of democracy. And when President Biden is saying America is back, we also would like to see more proactive position in how to say, in strengthening geopolitical actuality of Ukraine and the issue of Nord Stream 2 before Zelensky visit to Germany and then Merkel visit to Washington. I think it's really important not to step on the same на ті самі граблі, what we've seen during Merkel's visit to Kiev and then to Obama, when Merkel convinced Obama not to provide the lethal weapon to Ukraine. So I don't want to see the same story being repeated again. So I wish Ukrainian president to be pragmatic enough to defend our national interest, because it seems like some our Western allies, they don't understand that by protecting Ukraine, they are protecting also their interest, and it's not just about defending values.
Thank you, Hanna. We have 4 minutes left, and Mr. Pirchner, I would ask for your concluding remarks. So what would be your suggestions for the US policy towards Russia? And if I may, and I consider it to be a bit separate topic, but briefly, what would be the US policy suggestion from your side regarding Ukraine, which in my understanding shouldn't be part of US-Russia strategy, please?
First, US strategy towards Russia. Until the US policy aggressively hurts Russia through cyber war, through information warfare, it's going to be very hard to curb Russian behavior. I think only when Putin feels himself hurt more than he's able to politically suffer is any progress possible. I note that when Russian planes were overflying Turkish airspace, after a couple warnings, Erdogan shot down a Russian fighter. After that, then there were some agreements between Russia and Turkey, though the relationship is uneven at best. And I think if Russian behavior is not curbed, something serious like removal from the SWIFT system, massive information warfare inside of Russia to let the people know what's actually happening in the world. I think these are precondition towards any progress in the bilateral relationship with Russia. With regard to Ukraine, I think the United States is best served by giving Ukraine all Ukraine needs to defend itself. Things are on the way. Ukraine now has javelins. They have some electronic capability they didn't have before. They have some modest help on the Navy. I think all that needs to be increased by some multiple. To the extent that to the greater extent that Ukraine is seen able to cause great casualties should Russia invade further, that deters Russian action. I don't think Putin can afford to see large numbers of body bags coming back to Russia over a period of time. I think that's threatening to his rule. So making Ukraine more and more capable is a step towards stopping further advancements and maybe even a permanent settlement.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you for your participation in this presentation. We really enjoyed your answers. Thank you, Hanna, for your insights, for your vision.
May I also say thank you to Herman for organizing visits to Ukraine. The last was this May, and I think this is another sign of supporting Ukraine. So thank you, and we would like to see you coming to Ukraine and bringing more experts from Ukraine, from US, Germany, because I think it's really important to see what's happening in Ukraine, not from US, Washington, Berlin, but from Kiev and traveling to Eastern Ukraine.
Thank you, Hanna.
I certainly will come back, and I want to thank Hanna for coming to Washington, because visits of Ukrainians to the United States are extremely important because you get to reach more Americans that way, and I hope that continues, and as relationships build, more things will become possible.
So thank you for the participation, and I invite all the guests to look and to buy Post-Putin book published in Ukrainian, more to come. And let me use this opportunity also to announce our next action on June 29th. Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University is going to present the research on Ukraine's legislation regarding occupied territories in the last 6 years. Again, Mr. Pirchner, Hanna, thank you very much for taking time and for this great presentation, for your insights. Thank you, and look forward to our future meetings.
And thank you, Ostap, for moderation, and Ukrainian Catholic University for organizing, publishing this book, translation. I think it's really important. Thank you.